In the middle of the night, high above the Atlantic Ocean, smoke begins to fill the cockpit of a Swissair MD-1. A fire has started, and the pilots try desperately to get their plane back to the airport. Behind them, 227 lives hang in the balance. The pilots race through emergency checklists as conditions in the cockpit deteriorate. In the space above their heads, the fire has started to burn through critical aircraft systems. The first officer's instruments go dark, and he has to squint through the smoke to see his tiny backup instruments. Will the crew be able to get their stricken aircraft to an airport before time runs out? This is the chilling story of Swissair Flight 111. On the night of September 2, 1998, 215 passengers and 14 crew boarded Swissair Flight 111 at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. They were bound for Geneva, in Switzerland, a 7-hour journey. They had no idea as they settled in for the Atlantic crossing, that their flight number would become synonymous with one of the most terrifying events that can happen on board an aircraft. But, in 1998, Flight 111 had different connotations. It had become known as the United Nations Shuttle, because many of the passengers were UN officials who used it to travel between the organization's two main centers in New York and Geneva. The majority of the passengers on board were from the United States, France, and Switzerland, though in all, there were 21 different nationalities on the flight. On this night, the aircraft was also carrying a painting by Pablo Picasso. Up in the cockpit were two experienced pilots. In command of the flight was 49-year-old Urs Zimmermann. He had just under 11,000 hours of total flying time, 900 of which were on this aircraft, the MD-1. Zimmermann had started his career as a fighter pilot with the Swiss Air Force, before joining Swissair in 1971. He was also an instructor pilot, who trained new Swissair pilots to fly the MD-1. He was described as being someone who created a friendly and professional atmosphere in the cockpit, and who worked with exactness and precision. He was also keen to improve his knowledge of the aircraft he flew, and was known to question technical specialists in the maintenance department about the aircraft and its systems. Sitting beside him was 36-year-old Stefan Lowe. He had just under 5,000 hours of total flying time, just over 200 of which were on the MD-1. He too had started his flying career with the Swiss Air Force, and had been a fighter pilot for several years before joining Swissair in 1991. Like the captain, he was also an instructor pilot on the MD-1, and before flying this aircraft, had flown the Airbus A320 and the MD-80. He was described by colleagues as being a partner in the cockpit with a quiet and calm demeanor, but who could be assertive when appropriate. In other words, the passengers could not have been in safer hands for this transatlantic crossing. Just after 8 p.m. that evening, Flight 111 pushed back from the gate at JFK, with just over 63,000 kilograms of fuel in its tanks. This aircraft was a 7-year-old McDonnell Douglas MD-1. The MD-1 was a relatively new aircraft in 1998, having just been released 8 years previously. It had a modern so-called glass cockpit with digital displays, and a sophisticated navigation and autopilot system. Its 3 engines also made it a fuel-efficient alternative to 4-engine jets like the Boeing 747. Swissair had fitted the first and business class section of this particular aircraft with in-flight entertainment displays. While commonplace nowadays, they were an innovation in 1998, and Swissair was one of the first airlines to implement them. They allowed passengers to watch movies, play games, and even access the internet from their seats. As innocent as they seemed, on this night, these additions to the aircraft would end up putting the lives of everyone on board in grave danger. Shortly after 8:15 that evening, First Officer Lowe lined a massive aircraft up with the runway at JFK, and pushed the engines to takeoff thrust. On takeoff, the aircraft performed normally. There were thunderstorms along the route, so the pilots steered the aircraft left and right to avoid these, as they climbed up to their cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. At just before 9 p.m. that night, the captain contacted Mountain Air Traffic Control in Canada, and informed the controller that he was level at 33,000 feet. They were well and truly on their way now. In less than 6 hours, they would be back on the ground in Geneva. In the cabin, the 215 passengers tried to get some rest. Like the pilots, many of them had not been in New York for long enough to adjust to the time difference, and so it was effectively 3 o'clock in the morning for them. But within minutes of reaching their cruising altitude, the first officer noticed an unusual smell in the cockpit. He pointed this out to the captain, who agreed that something did smell odd. This was the first sign to the pilots that something was amiss. Shortly afterwards, the captain saw wisps of smoke coming from the ceiling behind the first officer, and pointed it out to him. It's not unusual for the air conditioning system to produce vapor on a plane. You may have seen this before as a passenger. So at first, the pilots weren't too concerned. In fact, the smoke was coming from a gap right beside the air conditioning vent in the cockpit. Nonetheless, just to be sure, the first officer handed control of the plane to the captain, and got up from his seat to investigate. He had a look around the area, but by this point the smoke had disappeared. The captain called a flight attendant up to the cockpit, and asked if she could smell anything odd, and whether there had seen any smoke in the cabin. She said that she could smell something in the cockpit, but that there was no smell in the cabin, and no sign of smoke. Captain, air conditioning, is it? FO, yes, the flight attendant then returned to the passenger cabin, and the pilots settled back into their seats. They had no idea that they were in mortal danger. Just above their heads, in the space between the cockpit ceiling and the skin of the aircraft, a fire was beginning to take hold. Electrical arcing from wires supplying the in-flight entertainment system had ignited insulation material, which began to smolder. For months, Swissair had been aware of overheating problems with the in-flight entertainment system. In fact, some airlines had even decided not to install it in their aircraft because of how much power it drew. We're about to see how consequential Swissair's decision to install the system was. The pilots were reassured that the smoke was likely from the air conditioning system, but just to check, they brought up the air page on the system display in the center of the cockpit. This showed them the status of the air conditioning and ventilation systems. They found nothing out of the ordinary here, nothing to give them a clue as to the source of the smoke they had seen. This came as a relief. Whatever they saw and smelled was likely nothing more than an air conditioning anomaly, and one that wasn't even significant enough to show signs of its existence on their instrumentation. At this point, things returned to normal in the cockpit. The captain turned on the passenger seatbelt signs when the plane encountered some turbulence, and he fetched updated weather information for the Atlantic. This return to normality would be brief. In fact, from this moment onwards, the cruise situation would deteriorate by the minute. Within seconds of the crew receiving the updated weather information, the smoke returned. This was a turning point for the pilots. They couldn't risk continuing out over the ocean with an unidentified source of smoke in the cockpit. They immediately began discussing potential diversion airports. Some way into this discussion, the captain looked back at the smoke, and said, "That's not doing well at all up there." Before this, the smoke had been wispy and intermittent. Now, it was getting thicker, and it wasn't going away. The captain declared a pan-pan, which is the international radio signal for an urgent situation. It's one step below declaring a mayday. Here is the actual air traffic control recording from that night. The pilot began descending to flight level 310 for 31,000 feet, as instructed by the controller. The pilots put on their oxygen masks and began preparing for a diversion. Boston Logan Airport was 300 nautical miles from their current position, or about 550 kilometers. With a possible fire on board, the crew might not have enough time to make it that far. The controller then suggested a much closer alternative. Halifax was just about 60 nautical miles from the plane, 5 times closer than Boston. But the crew were unfamiliar with it. If they made an approach to Halifax, they would have to scramble to fetch the charts from the library at the back of the cockpit, familiarize themselves with the approach procedures and airport layout, begin a rapid descent towards the airport, and set the plane up for landing, all while carrying out the emergency checklists for unidentified smoke. In other words, the workload required for an approach to Halifax was immense. However, the pilots knew that if they did indeed have a fire on board, they may not have a choice. In a fire, every second counts. Based on this, the crew made their decision. They were going to attempt to land at Halifax. The first officer put an altitude of 29,000 feet into the autopilot, and the pilots began preparations to land at Halifax. The atmosphere in the cockpit was calm, but focused. A rapid diversion like this would be demanding even if it wasn't being carried out in the potential presence of a deadly fire. Aware that the crew of Flight 111 would be extremely busy preparing their aircraft for an immediate landing, the pilots of a nearby British Airways aircraft offered to help them out by providing the weather at Halifax. This saved the pilots from having to manually fetch the weather, and bought them precious time to carry out their checklists. The controller then cleared them down to 10,000 feet. As part of standard procedure for any aircraft in an urgent situation, the controller asked the pilots for the amount of fuel they had on board, and the number of passengers. But the crew were too busy to check this information. They had to triage what was essential for them to get done, and what could wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was that they could get the plane down quickly for a landing at Halifax. The first officer put the aircraft in a steep descent, losing 4,000 feet in altitude every minute. He changed the selected speed on the autopilot from 295 knots to 310 knots in an effort to reach Halifax more quickly. But given how fast the plane was descending, it had started to speed up even beyond this. The captain warned the first officer against letting the plane get too fast, as doing so could damage it. He extended the speed brakes on the wings to stop the plane from overspeeding, but still, there was a careful balance to be struck. Go too fast, and risk damaging the aircraft, or go too slow, and risk having the plane be engulfed by fire. The captain told Chief Flight Attendant that there was smoke in the cockpit, and that he should prepare the cabin for a landing at Halifax in the next 20 minutes. In the passenger cabin, there was no sign of smoke or fire. To the passengers, the diversion to Halifax would have been nothing more than an annoying inconvenience. They were completely oblivious to the gravity of their situation. As the captain was fully occupied with emergency checklists and airport charts, he assigned both the flying duties and radio duties to the first officer. The flight was then transferred over to a different controller, and the first officer made contact. Runway 06 was more or less a straight-in approach for the pilots. This would have been ideal, but they were too high. If they dug down to land on runway 06, they would be way too fast to land. The first officer informed the controller of this, and asked him to repeat the frequency of the instrument landing system. They would use what's known as a backbeam approach to navigate to the runway accurately, as it was too cloudy to see the runway out the windscreen. Meanwhile, the captain had called a flight attendant to the cockpit to get him the approach charts for Halifax. She handed him the crew bag containing charts for hundreds of airports around the world, and the captain began routing through it in search of the charts for Halifax. This turn to the north would give the crew some more time to descend, and to set the aircraft up for landing at Halifax. But even there was a big problem. They had barely taken off from New York an hour ago, so their aircraft was still of fuel. If they landed while this heavy, they may not be able to stop their aircraft before the end of the runway. They would have to dump fuel to get the plane down to a safe landing weight. The pilots began discussing where it would be best to dump the fuel. Thank you for watching. Next part kuliah comment ka dijai ki.